So tonight is ECS 110. We're day 4, Critical Theory and Unsettling Canada. And it is May 15th, 2019. Thanks for being here tonight. Some of the work that we have to do is around assignments, but then also we're going to continue from, not last week, but from Monday. Apologies. From last class. You still need to do a little bit of summary on the Stanley and Daschuk readings. And then we'll think through disrupting or attempting to unsettle the Canadian normative narrative or some of the Canadian normative narratives by applying critical theory. So you had some questions around Stanley, and you were in groups of you were in some breakout groups, and we're not going to go into those great breakout groups right this instant. We'll save those for a little bit later on tonight, but I want to remind you what the questions were. We asked you for some examples that Stanley offers where the common sense use of Canada or Canadian results in excluding people, and sort of understanding why you think we all as in Canada believe certain grand narratives or normative narratives. Where did we learn it? And who benefits from such single normative narratives of Canada, and who is left out? So what I would like to invite you to do is to remind yourself of your responses. You filled out a form like this together, and activity 3 you were working on and looking at some of those questions. Group 1 and Group 2 did some work there, and then Group 3 and Group 4 were who benefits from the single grand narrative of Canada and who were left out. And then Groups 5 and 6 were discussing the reading called Clearing the Plains, the 2-pager by James Daschuk, which is part of a larger book around what national normative narrative this author attempted to interrupt or disrupt. So I would like you to review, like, you remember which group you were in. I'm not going to put you back in those same groups tonight. We're going to have different groups later. But I would like you to review what you worked on with your group. And then I would like someone to volunteer from thoughts from those discussions from Monday, just to recall what you were discussing in your groups on Monday, similar to what you did with Katya around the Thomas King reading. So you're not going to have a breakout moment to decide who's going to talk. You're just going to attempt to speak up and take a risk. And if you were in Group 5, or even if you weren't in Group 5 and you want to talk about that piece, you can volunteer by raising your hand as we've been practicing, or even simply just unmuting. But sometimes the unmuting, if we all try to speak at once, it gets confusing. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read your bit or remind yourself of what you talked about, and think about if there's anything that you would want to share for the whole class. What is the idea of the paper and the question that we ask you to do? And we're going to start with the groups 1 and 2. If you were in groups 3 and 4, just simply go to the weekly plans and take a peek from last week. The link is there for you. I will also actually put it in the chat just so that you have it really easily. There you go. Okay, so anyone who was in group 1, was there something that you would like to share? So list some of the examples that Stanley offers where the common sense use of Canada or Canadian results in excluding peoples. Why do you think we believe in this grand narrative, or where did we learn it? Who might summarize for us? Who was in group 1? You raise your hand in the participant section if you were in group 1. Does this mean that we don't remember? I see a couple people shaking heads. We don't remember which group we were in. You were all only in one of these pieces, right? Oh, Lachlan's saying, oh, maybe I have the wrong document. You're saying that you haven't done this yet. Pardon me. Okay, that's fine then. We'll go to the piece where you're not finished. My mistake. So I will put you into the groups then, and where they'll be changed. Okay, just give me 1 second. Pardon me, that was my misunderstanding. I did talk to Katya about, we did have a conversation about what you did, and I thought that she meant that you had already taken it up, like that you had already done the work, you just didn't have time to discuss. That's my mistake. Okay, we're going to come back to this bit. I apologize for the confusion. Instead, we'll do a warm-up. No big deal. We're going to talk about the reading where you, there was one reading where they asked you to think about what happened in Kelleher. You've all read that, yes? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to put you into some breakout groups, and I want you to try and use the ideas from critical thinking to take up what's going on here. So again, like last week, we were talking about how we're not asking you to, when we do this kind of work, we're not saying like, do you agree or do you disagree? We're not talking about opinions. We're talking about trying to take up critical thinking. So what stories are being told? Who's telling those stories? Whose stories are silenced? Where are the identities working in this story, in this article? And what questions might you ask? Or what worldviews are these pieces coming from? So you talked a little bit about dualisms or dichotomies and binary constructions in the Thomas King reading. We've talked a little bit about Canadian normative narratives and also identities as plural and subject positions. I'm not sure if you've used the word worldview before, but just to help you a little bit with your conversation in using critical theory, you want maybe to consider what worldview is being presented in the reading and why you think that's happening. So a couple of metaphors for worldview. One is that worldviews are the water in which we swim. Normative narratives are around us all the time, but if we were a fish, we might not notice the water. It's similar to like we walk around all day and we breathe in and out, but we don't always pay attention to the fact that we're breathing air in and out on a constant basis. The other metaphor is worldviews are like an iceberg. We only see the tip. We only see the behavior. And underneath of the surface of the water are the values, the beliefs, and our worldviews. The things that are often hidden to us, but affect how we behave. So that's like 90% is underneath of the surface of the ocean. We only see the tip. We only see the ways that we take up worldviews. So for critical theory and critical thinking, you want to attempt to notice normative narratives, question where they come from, whose worldview are they operating in, and why do you think that's so? Is that all right? Okay. So I'll get your breakout groups ready here. You'll be in small groups today. You'll have 2 or 3 people in your room. You do not have to make a recording, or like notes on a document, but I would like you to pay attention to who might share on behalf of your group. Okay, so try to use critical theory. What does critical theory mean to you after the reading? Thanks, everybody. So let's talk about those readings that you did. Here's another one. There's lots of them in the past few days about this particular situation in this small town in Saskatchewan. And so tell me what you discussed and how you used critical theory in your discussion of what was going on here. Anyone who would like to start is great. Go ahead, Angela.
Hi, so we kind of we talked more about the media's perspective on how it came across in his plane. In the story of the flag being on the house, they never once published the man's name. They never said a whole lot about where their house was, partially I think because they just said right away that he was harmless and he lived with his grandparents, whereas in the other article about the man burning the flag, his name was published, his age was published, exactly everything that he had done had been published. So we looked at it more of the way that the media is playing it to make a bigger, not that it's not a big deal, it's a big deal, but that it, against each other more than so much everything else. We looked more at the media part of it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. So you're looking at the ways that the stories are told in the article about the players, the actors, the behavior from these individuals, and how the media is framing each individual. Is very good.
Yeah. And then that is also giving people their own thoughts on who's in the right and who's in the wrong, right? And picking sides instead of the bigger problem
Good. So critical theory does ask us to do those things. It's not about picking sides necessarily, but about thinking about why we might tend to want to pick one side over the other based on a story that is told about a situation and the complexities in that story. Thanks, Dana, for Dana put their group 3 conversation in the chat, so you can take a peek there. Is there another group that wanted to talk about the discourses in the media? So group 3 is talking about how the article said that the person who put up the flags was not grown up, or they talked about them like referred to them as a kid. And then the way that the person who took the flag down to burn it as a fix, we want to talk about those things as well. So how is that person also portrayed by the media? I think someone has their hand up. Katie, go for it.
Okay, so I'm really bad with critical thinking. I'm very much, this is my opinion right away initially. So when I got into our breakout room, I initially was like, the guy put something up that knew would probably offend more people than not offend them. And the authorities tried to do their job and didn't succeed. So this guy dealt with it himself. And then my group looked at it right away as he shouldn't have been touching something that wasn't his own. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's I guess another layer that I didn't look at any of the layers. I guess I wasn't good with the critical thinking part.
Looking at the layers, thank you very much, Katie, for picking up looking at the layers. So the ways that the titles are in these articles are really important to think about the layers within. So the tensions between what's the RCMP's job, what is the law? So the RCMP stated in a lot of these articles that it's not against the law to put up Nazi flags or Confederate flags. It's not against the law, but it is against the law to take someone's Nazi or Confederate flag down and burn it. So that's why it's framed in this RCMP investigating. Who are they investigating? They're not investigating the guy that put up the flags, right? So this is interesting to think about the layers, and the layers include the way that our society operates. So why, those flags are often seen as hate speech, and why is hate speech not illegal? We hold free speech to such a high standard that it becomes this interesting tension when we say that someone can't say something, right? Because we live in a democracy. So these are all the complicated layers. I think Kyle had their hand up. Is that true, Kyle? Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, it's not against the law. Like in some countries, it's against the law to display Nazi flags and Nazi symbols. But when it becomes more of a public opinion thing, and you can see by how this blew up and became a national story that it's clearly people don't like it. And I'm sure that when this guy put it up, his neighbors were probably telling him that they didn't like it and they wanted it to come down. But when someone starts coming, if someone comes onto their property and takes it, then that does become breaking the law. And obviously the two symbols aren't anywhere even remotely close to each other. But if someone had a rainbow flag up and someone came onto their property and tore it down and burned it, then obviously people would see that as being something terrible. But in terms of just without excluding morality and just looking at in terms of the law, that would be the same thing. But
yeah, so that's where it becomes tricky and where the layers start to happen, right? So we are starting to think about, you're doing really well, you're starting to think about why is the law the way it is? In what ways do these symbols represent something different than the example that Kyle just used, right? So this represents often, this article says that it represents racial supremacy, and that the Confederate flag is also associated with racism, white supremacy, and slavery. So this is something different than than a pride flag, right? Than a rainbow flag. This is different. The rainbow flag's message is of love and acceptance and community. And so we need to think about why our society is equating those two things in those ways in the sense of the law. And that's part of the intention with critical theories, to ask questions about our systems. So you're doing really well. We have Lachlan and Jesse who want to say something.
Okay, my group, we talked about a lot of things that have already been said, like how the articles used two very different languages, like two different tones when they referred to the man who put up the flags as a boy, and he's 34 years old. And then they talked about how, like, they treated the man with the flags a lot differently than the man who ripped down and burned the flags. They had a lot more aggressive wording in the article talking about the man who ripped it down.
Can you give us an example of the aggressive language?
Well, saying that he ripped down and burned instead of he took them down and burned them. Like,
yes,
ripped down sounds a lot angrier than took down.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, and the fact that they called that the police, or the RCMP, called the man's parents instead of him about this matter, like, really stood out to us, because it seemed like they didn't take it seriously, but almost didn't seem that it was as important to contact him personally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jesse's next. Oh, we have so many hands up. Jesse, go for it.
Me and Jean-Luc kind of talked about what you and Kyle were discussing. It kind of seems like they're investigating the wrong person. Says they're investigating the person who took down the symbol of hate. And we kind of question, why is presenting a symbol of hate so blatantly in our society okay? And we questioned some of the gray areas in our laws. Like, the RCMP were kind of forced to, I guess, investigate the man who took the flag down, and there's kind of a gray area where no one has the right to take the flag down except the owner. And we kind of also discussed, well, what drove this person to display such a blatant symbol of hate so everyone could see it.
Yeah, really good, Jesse. And Jean-Luc. Jean-Luc, did you want to jump in there too, seeing how your hand is up as well?
Yeah, I was going to throw just a couple more pieces out there, because we also brought up our Constitution in addition to laws, and really both parties, the one who hung the flag and the one who took it down, both of them behaved in a very irresponsible manner, not really taking into account what was around them. And then the RCMP is caught in the middle of general public opinion towards flying such flags, at the same time also working within the constraints of our laws and our Constitution. I mean, our Constitution does afford Canadian citizens a freedom of speech and expression, and at the same time, we're also dealing with someone who basically committed destruction of property and trespassing under our laws as well. So really, what would be the best measure to take here? How do we address both the flag bearer as well as the person who took it down, and how do we view this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so critical theory is where it doesn't necessarily prescribe, it doesn't say to you, this is the correct mode. The questioning that you just engaged in is the point of critical theory, in order to make the conversation more complex, so that we refrain from the tendency to just say, that's the right answer. This is exactly what we have to do. So again, I'm not trying to say that I am neutral in this conversation at all, even though it seems like I'm not giving an answer one way or the other, and that I'm trying to tout critical theory as the way to take up this issue. We're using this as practice for critical theory. And so critical theory wants to dismantle like systems of oppression. And so the way to attempt to dismantle systems of oppression is to ask questions about those systems. So you're doing that when you say things about like under Canadian law, and this is how we think about property. So then maybe we can layer that with like, why do we think about property in that way? Why do we think about speech in these ways, like free speech in these ways? I'm not saying that I don't believe in free speech. I'm not saying that we need to crack down on different kinds of speech, but that it's interesting that we allow all kinds of speech in equal ways. And so critical theory asks us to sort of pick apart what's going on here in complicated ways. Jillian suggests that maybe they're calling this person, the 34-year-old person, a boy, and harmless. Maybe there's some connections to mental health or capabilities, or personal struggles, whatever that means. But notice how those things are also like, it seems to make it okay. So like if a person doesn't quite understand, then it's okay. Like I'm not sure it's okay. So I want to just layer this a little bit more for you, because we don't know each other that well. And I know that there's a bunch of hands coming up. So if you feel like we're going off topic from what you were wanting to say, just stick it in the chat. The layer that I want to attach to this is that Kelleher is my hometown. I went to high school in Kelleher, and I recognize the house in that town. Kelleher is really small. It's like less than 300 people. I lived on a farm just north of there. My parents still live there. In fact, I'm going there this weekend. So part of the reason that I want to tell you that is because I know Darcy King, for example, the mayor. My sister went to school with Darcy King's son. And I saw my sisters and brother yesterday and asked them, hey, do you know who it was that put up those flags? Like, do you know whose house that was? I forget whose house that was. You know, I haven't lived there for 20 years or something like that, even though I go back quite often. Like, whose grandparents are those? You know, whose house is that? And so they say, well, I think it's so-and-so. I think it's this person, but I'm not sure. It's just like what's swirling around on Facebook. People from high school or whatever are talking about that they think it's so-and-so that put it up. And so then we tell all of the stories about so-and-so. And we say, oh, yeah, that figures. You know, he was a troublemaker when he was in school. I'm not surprised. And even those comments make it okay. We pretend that it's okay, like, oh, sure, it's just him. He's kind of nutty. Like, let him be. He's, you know, that discourse of he's not harmful allows this seriousness of putting up the flags to be diminished. So it's like a common rebuttal. We haven't got into common rebuttals much yet, but even saying like, Caleb Peltier shouldn't have burned the flag because it was destruction of property is a common rebuttal. And so critical theory also asks us to go, okay, maybe it's destruction of property and that's maybe not responsible and it's against the law. But also if Caleb Peltier, how else would Caleb disrupt this conversation? So if you sit back and be silent and just say, yeah, he's just a boy, he's just a kid, he didn't mean anything by it, then we're reproducing the system of hate speech, of white supremacy, and of racism. So even the fact that they didn't name so-and-so, right? I'm just going on speculation. I'm not telling you the name right now because I'm not actually sure it's that person. In the articles, there's a problem that they don't name the person who put up the flag, but then they name Caleb Pelletier. And they name Caleb Pelletier partially because they're from George Gordon First Nation, and their last name's Pelletier, and they're Indigenous. And so the way that this is taken up is that the Indigenous person has now been criminalized in this story, whereas the whole initiation of the whole reason this is happening is because of the 34-year-old person who put up the flag. And so it draws attention away from that person. So critical theory is asking us to look about all of those tensions at play, like why the mayor would say that the 34-year-old never grew up. They're trying to reinsert or reproduce Kelleher as innocent. Like, we're a good town, we're full of good people. It's just this one person that did something kind of stupid. Okay, so that reproduces and allows Confederate flags and Nazi symbols to be shared. And at the same time, maybe you have thoughts about not wanting other people to take matters into their own hands and become vigilantes and whatever, right? The point here, the reason we want to talk about these kinds of articles tonight is because we want you to start using critical theory to look at all of the complexities in the ways that we tell stories about ourselves and the ways that we react to stories in our world. So this is definitely close to home to me. And last night when I was talking to my sisters and brother about it, I needed to sit back and go like, why are we telling this story about so-and-so? Why is it just being diminished again? Or why is Caleb Pelletier represented in this way in the media? Those are all really important. I think some of the chat work that you've got going on here in the chat is around opinions, and we've been practicing not just saying like my opinion about this matter is, or let's just agree to disagree, but to make the conversation more and more complex, to show that it's not just this or that, it's not right or wrong, even though I have a particular stance on this piece, right? Like, you can tell already, I haven't said it, but you can tell that I don't want people to put up Nazi symbols and Confederate flags in my communities, and that I want this person who put it up to have some consequences. And so I'm not saying you have to have those same thoughts as I do, but that we're working through by using critical theory to take up the complexities in the ways that the stories are told. So even if this comes from a place of ignorance, even if this person, this 34-year-old person, is who I think it is, that is no excuse, okay? Even if we're ignorant, that is no excuse to reproduce racism, white supremacy, and hate. This is my way of understanding how critical theory can break down normative narratives that are problematic. So we're going to do more work here. We have other comments in the chat. I thank you for those chat pieces. Anissa, we have Anissa and Tandy and Kelsey. Is there something that you want to say aloud? Any of you?
Yeah, sorry, I did just want to say, yeah, like I agree with what you were saying. I had put in a different article, they do mention the thing about he has his own personal struggles, and I put that in there, and I felt like I didn't get to like say that, yeah, I feel like they're using that a way to be like, oh, he's just ignorant, but Like, if you're putting up this flag and displaying it, you should know what it means. You should know the connotations that come with it. And that, like, that's, yeah, it's not acceptable to just be like, oh, he doesn't know the harm that he's caused. Well, he should, because he's the one that's displaying it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Kelsey?
All right. I just had another point, just talking about the normative narratives. I think it's interesting, or like important to recognize that this happened in a small town in Saskatchewan, like not anywhere else in Canada. I think in small towns in Saskatchewan, like, obviously not putting up Nazi flags is what lots of people do, but there are like a lot of people who like have voice, like, that I know that have these like same opinions, just don't express them as much. Like in small towns, they just have like a different viewpoint than like a big city center where there is more like different kinds of people. Just it being in a small town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of the reason I wanted to share, Katya and I had talked about whether or not you would all talk about this on Monday or not, and I asked if we could talk about it tonight, because it's important, I think, for us to remember that these happen in our own communities. These kinds of tensions happen in our homes, in our interactions with the people that we know the best. And so that's part of the reason why we're asking you to write self-stories, to think about how these things, how normative narratives play out in your own lives. There's one more thing I think that Tandy said that's in the chat that's worth bringing up. So one of the things that happens when the mayor says this 34-year-old just never grew up, and that we don't get to hear from why they decided to put up the flag, that reproduces the idea that that they don't have to justify themselves. So Tandy's calling it that we don't let the offensive side speak their mind. We don't actually engage with them. So we don't, it doesn't say anywhere that I read that they asked the person for comment and they declined. Did any of you read that? No. And so Tandy's point is important. Perhaps instead of letting this person sit in ignorance and just go, oh, okay, I'm not allowed to put those flags up. I don't know why I'm not allowed to put them up. I just know that people don't like it. Perhaps engaging with them might have helped to clarify the context so that we don't have all of these what if, like what if they have mental illness? What if they have learning disabilities? What if they have personal struggles that who knows what that means, right? So when we don't allow people who we think are doing something offensive to also engage and just blanket with they're just a kid or they don't know any better or whatever, that can be an issue. So again, we're not doing this in order to have 2 or 3 or 4 camps where we all say, well, I think this should have happened and I think this should have happened and why didn't they do this or why didn't they do that? Critical theory is not really just about finding the one answer, because there's multiple responses here. It's not just one response, it's multiplicities of responses. For the point of disrupting our systems so that our systems are more socially just. So I think I'm going to go through a few things around critical theory to try and give you a little bit more background about it from the text, just as a summary. And then I'll put you back into small groups again. And we can take up the Stanley and Daschuk pieces to close class tonight. We have just talked about that. So critical theory is, critical theory and critical thinking aren't necessarily synonymous. Critical thinking is part of critical theory, but critical theory is an academic way of knowing that examines how society works. So it's like an academic tradition, you could say, or a lens to see how our societal systems are reproductive of oppression? I'm not going to talk about the scientific method right now. That's just a question. Besides that, I'll say there's a myth, there's a story that we tell, there's a normative narrative that says that there's only objective truth and then subjective ways of knowing, and one way is right and the other way is wrong. And sometimes that's phrased as being unbiased or being neutral. Objectivity is seen as the better way. And I think we don't have to always just talk about rationality and objectivity in critical theory, because when we're looking for systems of oppression, this comes by noticing patterns in our daily stories. So that's where subjectivity can be helpful. Remember, one of the five guidelines was about looking for patterns, not anecdotes. So why should we even care about theory? Maybe it's makes you kind of feel sick to talk about theory instead of the practicalities of what this might look like in schools. But looking at theory allows us to think about the worldviews or the lenses, the glasses that we're looking at the world through and making sense of the world with, whether or not we recognize it. So I actually use the metaphor of my glasses. My glasses help me see, right? I'm nearsighted, and so I can't see far away. And my worldview does the same thing. My worldview puts a particular color on the rest of the world, or on the way that I take up the world, whether or not I recognize it. That's what it means to live in the water or swim in the water, or only be able to see the tip of the iceberg. So whenever we ask how or why about anything, we're engaged in this kind of theorizing. Critical theory and other kinds of theory, we can just think about them as maps that we follow to navigate the world and to make sense of our lives and the encounters we have as we live. Everything we do in the world, all of our actions are guided by a worldview, which in some ways is our theory of living. And again, no theory is ever neutral. Even critical theory is not neutral. Critical theory's slant is to say there is oppression in the world and we need to disrupt and counter oppression. Critical theory is not neutral. It does ask us to ask a whole bunch of questions in order to do that disruption about our normative narratives. But it's not factual. We're not looking for fact here. It's not fact or myth. Critical theory asks us to question those things that seem unquestionable so that the invisible becomes visible. So we think with critical theory by thinking with complexity. When we say critical thinking, we don't just mean we're being critical of one another or critiquing one another or being negative. It's not about being negative. It's about considering how to make our understandings of the world more complicated. So we're not just treating all opinions as equal, or that that every opinion is equally valid. For example, if I said to you that I believe the world is flat, you would probably argue that that is not as equally valid as the understanding that the world is round, that the world is a sphere. So critical theory is similar. It's used to make arguments. It's a kind of intellectual skill of analysis. So we go beyond the surface of things, or we at least attempt to. We explore nuances and multiplicities. We look for the effects of social systems and the power dynamics. I don't think we've talked about hegemony yet. Hegemony is like normative narratives, but it's the imposition of those normative narratives from a dominant group onto everyone else in society. And we become complicit in these stories, in the systems of inequity. We reproduce them with those common rebuttals, like I was saying to you before, those thoughts that are like, oh yeah, that's just so-and-so. Even when we don't even realize that we're doing it. we're going to talk more about common rebuttals as we go through the course, but I just want you to pay attention to the ways in which critical theory asks us to look for hegemonic systems of power. And the way that those power dynamics reproduce normative narratives that make the subject, that make who we are, that tell us what our identities are, that form our ways of understanding about our social positions in the world. Really, boiled down, critical theory is just grappling with society. And it requires that we're curious about life, that we attempt a kind of intellectual humility where we allow ourselves to realize that we don't know everything, that not everything is in our awareness, that we look at the world through our social positions, through our glasses, through our worldview, and that we can be generous with one another. Critical theory is not dependent on consensus or agreement. Remember, we don't just use the statement, we're just agreeing to disagree. That's an excuse to not engage. Instead, ask questions of each other, ask where our ideas come from, interrupt the normative narratives that seem problematic. So we're really wanting to disrupt the claim that knowledge is objective, universal, factual, unbiased, or neutral. That's what critical theory asks us to do, to question those common sense or the normative narrative that there's some sort of objective knowledge out there as universal, capital T truth. So we want to tonight unsettle the normative national narratives about Canada and what it means to live in Canada, and think about ourselves as Canadian if you identify as Canadian. We're going to talk about if the normative narrative of Canada is bad. All of these pieces that you wrote, these are yours, I think. I think I got the right one now. Are all of these bad? We're not necessarily needing to just say this is good, this is bad, bad, good, bad, good. Notice how that reproduces the binary again, the dualisms. And critical theory asks us to be more complex about things. So it's not just about good or bad. It's about, let's notice the story of Canada, the normative narratives of Canada, and think about how some of these things might be problematic. How could we tell a more complex story or a more equitable story about Canada? And why should we even think about it if we're not going to teach social studies? I used to use the common rebuttal when I was in my teacher ed program 20 years ago or so. I'm going to teach math. I don't, like, why should I care about this stuff? I don't need to know it. I'm going to teach math. And that was a problematic statement that continued to reproduce problematic normative narratives. So we're going to ask some questions about Canada, Canada as innocent, Canada as multicultural, Canada as polite, Canada as nature, as farmers, as simple, as family-centered, as volunteer and communities, as fun, even as multicultural. We're going to ask questions about those things in the next couple weeks. So let's use Stanley and Daschuk to start doing that. We have 8 groups, I think. You were in 8 groups last week, right? Thumbs up if that's right. Can a few of you show me 8 groups? I think so. So groups 1 and 2, you're going to take a note on this question. And group 3, who benefits, who's left out. Group 4 and 5, what normative narrative does Daschuk try to interrupt? Group 6, why do you think this is not part of the common sense? Oh, now you're only in 6 groups. Never mind. I'll put you in 6. And let me put this in the chat so that you can edit. Some of you are in there already. That's great. I'll probably give you around 7 minutes, at least 7 minutes to do this piece. Just gonna pause the recording. Great, let's hear from group 1 around Stanley. And remember, we're trying to take up critical theory in order to unsettle normative narratives about Canada. So we're asking questions like this. What does the story of Canada leave out? Who does it privilege? How can we tell a more complex story or a counter story? Why does this matter to us as people who want to teach, no matter what subject we want to teach? So let's hear from group 1. Who's speaking on behalf of group 1?
I am.
Great.
So yeah, our prompts were list some of the examples that Stanley offers where the common sense use of Canada or Canadian rules results in the exclusion of people. And one of the first things that we talked about was history proper begins with the arrival of Europeans. So when people think of Canadian history, they think of when European settlers came over, and they don't think about Indigenous people who were here for so much longer before that. And how going back to the power is knowledge kind of thing, how white settlers have always had the power to create the education system, and where we're learning these facts, and how that leads into our ground narrative, and how most people's, that's their universal truth is when Canadian history starts, which is not true.
Thanks very much, Anissa. That's great. Did you have one more point?
Just how when we use Canadian versus Indigenous, how it should be synonymous, but it's usually not.
Yeah, this is interesting as well, because Indigenous as a term is actually a global term. So Indigenous means all First Peoples in those particular regions globally. And so some Indigenous peoples in Canada argue that Indigenous does not mean Canada or Canadian, because treaties were, the parties of treaties were 2 nations. So First Nation signatories, and then representatives from the Crown that then became the Canadian state. So I understand your sentiment more so as being that we should recognize Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island as the first peoples of this land. And I think that's what you're trying to say, instead of saying that Canadian and Indigenous should be synonymous. First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples can choose if they want to identify as Canadian, but many don't, because they come from their own strong nations. So for example, in Treaty 4, Cree is a nation. Or in the north, the Inuit that's a nation. They are a nation. Even though in Canada we have this story that Canada is the nation here. But that's not necessarily the way that Indigenous peoples in this place that's now called Canada understand their own governance structures, education systems, and economic systems that have been, that are much older than Canadian systems of law, of education, of economy. So thanks very much, Anissa. That was great. Group 2, is there something that you can add?
Well, one of the first things we discussed were some of the examples where the common sense of Canada results in the exclusion of people. We talked about how a normative narrative is people had the right to vote at one date, but that wasn't actually true for everybody. It wasn't true for women, and it wasn't true for other groups of people. And so when we hear, you know, people had the right to vote at this date, we just grow up with that knowledge that we think that it was inclusive of everybody because that's what it says. When you look at the layers, it's not totally true.
Very good. Well done. The normative narrative here is that whiteness, whiteness is hidden. And so whiteness is often associated with a Euro-Western perspective. Thanks, Hillary. It's also great to see your little one on screen. I sort of didn't mean to cut you off. Is there something else that you wanted to say?
No, we ended up just getting in a pretty good discussion about just different normative narratives we heard in school. And
well done. Well done. So critical theory asks us to practice disrupting or countering those normative narratives that we've heard in school around textbooks, curriculum, or things like, yeah, the right to vote happened on this date, without remembering that First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples, women, Chinese immigrants, and other groups did not have those same opportunities at the same times as each other. So Canadians do not have this common history. No single narrative will ever make that true, is what Stanley says. We want each student in our classes as critical theorists, teachers, or as social justice teachers or anti-oppressive educators. Some of us might identify in those ways. We would ask, or we would hope that we make situations where we can enable each student to explore their own paths and to construct a narrative that explains how it is that they came to inhabit this common space of the classroom or a common space of the region or the province or the territory or the nation, and to allow other students to see and engage with their own narratives. Again, this is part of what we want you to do with your self-stories. What are your narratives that are around how you inhabit this space of learning? And so we'll hear from one more group around the Stanley reading. Who benefits from the single grand narrative of Canada, those normative narratives, and who's left out? You have a lot of great notes here, and thanks to all three of these groups for including page numbers. Well done. That's good academic practice. Group 3, what would you like to share? You don't have to share every single point. Is there a summary that you have, or one of the points that was seemed most provocative to you?
I think the general idea is that the narrative benefits the dominant group because from what we're told, history begins when European settlers came. So that's just exclusion of all others.
Good. So who is seen to be, let's name it, because in our worldview, in a Euro-Western worldview, the dominant group is often not named. So how do we name these people? People like me. Who am I? I'm part of the dominant group. I'm complicit in dominant narratives that oppress others. Who am I? Put it in the chat.
Like, do you mean white people?
Yep, good. These are the things. So we name whiteness. What else do we name? Who else am I?
English speaking?
Yep, good. English speaking.
Upper middle class.
Yep. Even middle class, but yep, upper middle class, sure. Euro-Western means that I have European ancestors. What else? Yeah, cis. So I'm a cis woman, but we can also think about the dominant group in terms of gender. Well, yeah, we have men as the dominant group in terms of gender, and specifically cis men. And then also we have educated, which goes along with middle class. So whatever we think about educated. One Cree knowledge keeper sometimes tells one of my classes, you think you're all educated, but you don't even know who your great grandparents are. That's not education. So it depends on how you think about what it means to be educated. Heterosexual. Good. What else? Those with settler backgrounds. Yeah, Euro settler backgrounds. People of authority. So these people are usually seen to be people of authority or perceived to be. We also have Christianity is listed. And again, this isn't in order to make anyone feel guilty or bad or terrible about themselves. This is trying to notice in Canada where the normative narrative comes from. And it predominantly comes from this group of people, not individuals, but individuals who are part of this group. Okay, these are where our normative narratives, our worldviews come from. So then, yes, we say it's sort of like the exclusion to the exclusion of all else. And that's where narratives of multiculturalism comes in order to make it seem like we are all equal. So you have some really good notes here. Make sure that everyone has taken a peek. Let's think about how dash check disrupts differently. So group 4, what national normative narrative does dash check attempt to interrupt? And what example does he use? Just give us one of your points.
The main thing that he tries to disrupt that we talked about was just that, like, the narrative of equality in Canada, that like everybody has an equal opportunity to succeed, no matter like what their social station, because as he points out, First Nations people, especially those on reserve, are at a significant disadvantage in terms of healthcare, education, and like potential opportunities available to them. Like him saying that like there's a significant, like a huge increase between like tuberculosis rates is like the one that we had. That's like a disease that I think most people would think of as kind of like more of a disease of the past.
Yes, very good.
Because like I don't know anyone or know anyone who knows anyone that's ever had tuberculosis, but and a lot of reserves don't have like clean water, which is something that in the city you'd completely take for granted.
Yeah, so some of this is infrastructure problem, and we want to notice that there are common rebuttals that might be coming up, or things that you've heard other people say, like, well, those communities just don't take care of themselves, or those communities don't know how to make sure that their water's good, or those communities have brought it on themselves. All of those are common rebuttals that reproduce the problematic narrative that everyone has equal opportunity in Canada, and that is not, in fact, it's not that simple. So critical theory helps us to look for the nuances so that we can see, other things are happening here that maybe we should pay attention to. Group 5, can you add on to that, please? You have some similar points here.
Yeah, we also touched on the narrative that there's kind of a normative narrative about Medicare, universal Medicare, and there's this social safety net that leaves no one behind. But as we kind of look at these stats here, we see that there's several stats that indicate First Nations people are being left behind, and there's big gaps in education funding and high infant mortality rates and the other ones that have already been mentioned. But then he also kind of touches on a bit of history and this normal narrative that treaties were all signed voluntarily, treaties and other agreements and land agreements to make way for settlers. He points out that food was basically used as a weapon back then to get these kind of a way of getting these First Nations to sign was bargaining with food with them, and in many cases that food would never come, and it was the government's goal to basically starve many of these First Nations people out of existence instead. So
yes, and so very good, Jesse, and group 5, group 4, all of you are doing very well taking up these readings and trying to look for the normative narratives and why and how they can be disrupted. It's important to recognize here that Dashak is trying to argue that the Canadian government was and still is participating and initiating and acting towards a process of assimilation, colonization, and cultural genocide, as well as biological genocide. So the bits about malnutrition, tuberculosis, disease, food, that's about assimilation, but more so it's about biological and cultural genocide to control First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And those 3 groups are different. So Indigenous, again, is global. And then when we talk about First Nations people, there are many groups within those that identifier. And then the Métis peoples are distinct from First Nations, and Inuit are distinct from both of the others. So we're trying to also take up terms and how terms are used. Let's see, is there anything else I want to say about that? You mentioned treaties. Jesse mentioned treaties. And so we'll talk about treaties a little bit as well in a minute before we go tonight. Very good. So the last group, can you wrap this up? Why do you think that Daschuk, or that the history that Daschuk described is not part of our common sense understandings of Canadian history? What's going on there? Why is this left out of curriculum? Why is it left out of normative narratives in Canada? Why do we prefer to call ourselves as Canadians all of these things: simple, homegrown, family-centered, community-minded, multicultural? Why do we prefer to talk about those things rather than some of the history that Daschuk described? What's going on there? Group 6.
I mean, of course, part of it's going to be that it's easier to describe yourself as positive rather than negative. We discussed that yesterday, but part of it, and he touches on this a lot, is going to be that when they define Canada and all these statistics and things like that, they're pulling the average, which, if there's such a large disparity, the average isn't representative in any way. It doesn't show the extremes of privilege that you see in the country. The other thing we talked about is how we use the word propaganda, which is a strong word, but I know we're using myths. But we're trying to show it Canada as this prosperous place, and they'll describe the hardships, and then in the next line be like, hey, come here. And it's trying to show it as this prosperous place, but they're not wanting to show the double-edged sword of prosperity. So they're not wanting to show that the new people and the new technology brought new disease and new famine, and they're not wanting to show that edge of it, that contradiction. And then the other piece was that we talked about how, like, the second-class children is a very strong phrase, and it's just that not everyone's treated equally as we're meant to believe. And then that contradiction obviously goes against those easy dichotomies that we were talking about in different areas. It's not good or bad, it's contradictory of that.
Mm-hmm. Well done. So let's sort of summarize with that then. Critical theory asks us to think through the contradictions, to disrupt the easy dichotomies and the binary constructions, the dualisms in our world, the good, bad, rich, poor, black, white, just one or the other. It's more complicated than that, is the argument from a critical theory perspective. You also might be interested in thinking about the feelings, responses, and body reactions that you've encountered throughout some of these readings, throughout reading about the Nazi and Confederate flags in small town Saskatchewan, reading about treaties, reading about settler responsibilities in the context of treaties, reading about the history. What are your own feelings? And how can you use those feelings as entry points? Remember those 5 guidelines? One of them was, what are your emotions and how can you use that as an entry point to further understanding and intellectual humility? So I'm going to just provoke you and then we're going to close. Here are some provocations to end with tonight. Canada Day is coming up. 2 summers ago, it was Canada 150. I've noticed the logo. Maybe some of you saw this 2 years ago. The logo's flipped upside down. And there were groups that resisted Canada Day celebrations for Canada 150 in particular, because so much media surrounded it, so much story surrounded it, so much money was put into Canada 150 to celebrate Canada 150 without considering how that can be made more complex and what whose stories are being reproduced there as innocent and who's missing. So some groups flipped that logo to say, wait a second, this is more about colonization and continued colonialism than it is about celebration. It's just framed in this really lovely celebratory way. So you can take a look. Just because Canada 150 is over doesn't mean that people have stopped resisting Canada Day. You might ask yourselves, what could I do this Canada Day that might be more ethical or attempt to unsettle Canada 152 to think about incorporating a better understanding of Canada history as not innocent, and also working with each other to make some sort of better relationships in the future. So sometimes that's called reconciliation, but also reconciliation is a problematic framework that has been created in education systems and government systems as sort of like a Band-Aid. And there's a lot of deeper work that goes along with reconciliation moments. We can't just say this is education for reconciliation. So you might look up Resistance 150, the hashtag, on social media. I have listed this poem by Christy Belcourt in the weekly plans, and I invite you to take a look at it and even listen to it. Christy Belcourt is a Métis artist and provocateur, so you can take a look at her website if you like. And there's also her poetry is written as well as spoken for this piece. So it's in the weekly plans, and think about how this tells a particular kind of truth that's often left out or preferred to be left out on days like Canada Day. How might you tell your own truth stories about what Canada is, and how can we disrupt the idea of empty Canadian prairies? I'm just talking about prairies because that's sort of where many of us are from. Sometimes this makes Canadians, those who identify as Canadians, feel pretty uncomfortable. And I just want to say here again that to notice those emotions in those moments of discomfort is important. This is a kind of teaching as well. It's called a pedagogy of discomfort. So I ask you to think about unsettling your normative narratives, those Canadian normative narratives, around what it means to be a treaty person. Yeah, I'm gonna put this down here. So I've given you a video from one of my past students from one of the treaty courses as a provocation. It's a song that he made about his own way for disrupting Canadian narratives. And then I want you to think about your own identities. Mine is a settler identity. I have settler ancestry, and I don't have any guilt or shame around that, but I do know that I'm complicit in the system that suggests that that my ancestors were part of creating the dominant narrative in our country. So it comes from things like the getting 160 acres because it seemed like no one was living there and it wasn't anybody's home. This is my great-grandparents on the left, Casper and Anna with the dog. So think about how you name yourself. I have settler ancestry, I'm a settler descendant. Who are your ancestors? What treaties have you benefited from? Maybe you're not a settler and that's okay. Settler isn't meant to be derogatory. It's meant to just talk about the non-Indigenous peoples living in Canada who form this European-descended socio-political majority. It's more specific than saying Canadian. So sometimes I say I'm a settler Canadian. It's not a racial category, so sometimes I say I'm a white settler Canadian. I'm going to skip over the idea of settler colonialism right now. Basically, it's just that colonialism is like saying you work for me, and settler colonialism is, oh, you over there, you who were here before me, I'm here now, so you go away. So that's sort of how settler colonization works. Like, I'm here now, I'm farming these lands, you First Nations people, you go to reserve. So that I don't have to think about you being that this land that I now occupy is yours. Also, there's a couple of notes here for provocations. If you are a descendant of Africans, you might not want to call yourself a settler. You don't have to think about yourself as coming from away and being here to stay because your ancestors were defined as legal property and cut off from your own Indigenous lands, and so you're not agents of settlement, although you are sort of in this body politic in a different way. Also, non-Black people of color aren't necessarily identified as settlers. It depends on depends on the individual, but this is mostly because they're not able to access the same social privileges as white settler descendants. The newcomers, the non-European or non-Black people of color newcomers, they don't have the same power to bring their laws and customs along with them, and they don't require others to assimilate into Canadian society, even with discourses of multiculturalism, which maybe you talked about on Monday. So we can think about treaty relationships instead. This is the closure. So these are all provocations for you. How do you identify? What are your own responsibilities to disrupt Canadian discourses? How could you do that on days like Canada Day? And then how does treaty relationships and treaty responsibilities work into the mix? So we're all familiar with the map of Canada, that's the provincial map, right? But how might the story of Canada become more complicated if we thought about treaty stories? So this is the treaty territory map, but specifically the numbered treaty territory map. So there's also treaties by the Great Lakes that were earlier treaties, and then there's modern treaties more in BC. The yellow regions, and in the east as well. The yellow or tan, like in the north in Nunavut, and Quebec, and the Maritime Coast, and then also BC, the BC coast and the Yukon, those yellow pieces, sometimes are referred to as unceded territory, which pretends that the numbered treaties, that the First Nations people there somehow gave over or gave up or surrendered their land, and that's not true. So the dominant story there, the Canadian normative narrative, is that this is all Canada. The only reason I am allowed to work and live and play in Treaty 4 is because First Nation peoples decided to enter into treaty and share land with my ancestors and the representatives of my ancestors. So think about whose traditional territory is the land in which you live within or have lived, and maybe it's not numbered treaty territory, but most often for us it will be. So think about changing the stories of how we tell How we tell the history of Canada there. In Treaty 4, you can ask questions like, so if we say it's the Treaty 4 was made between the First Nations in the area and the representatives of the Crown or the Canadian government, then who were those nations? And specifically, you can name them. You can look for how Cree people call themselves, the people of the Four Directions, and in their own language, Nehiawak, the Cree people. Or Nakaways are the Soto peoples in this area. And then there's also Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples that are part of Treaty 4 because of different histories. So not necessarily treaty histories, but there's the way that the United States politics play into that as well. And then Treaty 4 territory is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. Forgot the piece here, the accent. The Métis Nation, and there are 4 historically Métis communities in Treaty 4. However, the Métis Nation was not allowed to be part of the treaty making from the Crown, was not invited to be. So Métis peoples haven't benefited from treaties in the same ways, or they don't have the same kinds of treaty rights, but they are a nation in and of themselves. Métis does not mean mixed. It doesn't mean like a Cree father and a white mother. There's history there to family that is and culture that's different, that's distinct. So we can do that. We can try and learn the names of the nations in our regions to attempt to disrupt the story of Canada as just unified. Ask yourself, are you a treaty person? Why might you be a treaty person? Why might you identify in that way? And if you do identify, because it's not just about being status Indian or having a status card. There's a common sense story that treaty cards are the same as status card, and that's the joke here in the Briar Patch article. What if there was a settler treaty card so that we all recognize as settlers that we have benefited from treaties in so many ways that we'd never recognize in just like normative narrative conversations. Again, it's because my ancestors were allowed to farm here, to settle here, to have babies here, to have healthcare, on and on and on. So ask what your ethics are. How could you consider your own ethical way of living as treaty people? How can you do the difficult and sometimes uncomfortable work of coming to understand the significance of being a treaty person and your associated treaty responsibilities? If you live in treaty territory, it is often said that we're all treaty people, but there's some nuance there. I know some Métis people that say, I've never benefited from treaties, and I don't have the same treaty rights as First Nations, so I can't call myself a treaty person. Okay, so just like consider your own ancestors. These are provocations. I leave you with some reminders. We're not meeting on Monday, it's Victoria Day. So even that holiday, we're celebrating what? What are we celebrating for Victoria Day? Why do we have the day off? Anyone? Why do we have the day off? Yeah, we're celebrating Queen Victoria and the British Empire. Empire here is important. Empire is a colonial state. Empire attempted to assimilate, control, and get rid of Indigenous peoples, and they were not successful. Indigenous peoples are still here. They're still thriving. They're still connected to the land in many ways. And many of them still are working to it's getting late, I'm losing words. Revitalize languages and revitalize ceremony. So what are your connections to treaty, and what are your treaty responsibilities, is the provocation that we might say on Victoria Day and the upcoming Canada Day. Lastly, there's some tasks in the weekly plans. You've got commenting on your partner as assigned on self-story 2. Here it is, and it's in the weekly plan list. And then also those of you who signed up for reading response number 1, it's about being a treaty person and what that means and what your responsibilities are there. So we have Louisa, Jessie, Jillian, Jean-Luc, and Kyle working on the first provocation so that we can all respond in the following week. So you'll be assigned partners for that as well later on next week. You also have your writing the self story number 3 this week. It's about class. Sometimes it's like the normative narrative is that there is no class in Canada, or that we're all middle class. But I want you to think about instances around or moments where you felt your socioeconomic status pretty in a palatable way, in a way that seemed visceral. So for me, an example that I would tell is like when I was a kid, my parents put me in piano lessons. That's an example of being middle class. We'll talk more about racism next week, race and racism, and the construction of that story and how it's connected to these pieces around being Canadian. There's a treaty quiz in the weekly plan that I want you to do as well. It's not meant to be, it's not for grades. We just call it a treaty quiz just to see what you know about treaties. And we'll discuss next week. So follow the weekly plans as they're listed and you will not forget anything. If you haven't turned comment moderation off, make sure you do that. And if you encounter problems with your partner, let them know in the Slack community. The prompt here for classism for your story number 3, remember to be detailed, including rich descriptions and embodied text. There's the list of the week 5 folks for reading response, the partner comments, the treaty quiz, and then the assigned readings, which is really just these ones. There's one from the textbook that's a little bit long, so don't wait until, Tuesday to do it. It's 21 pages, but it's important. And we don't have class on Mondays, so you should have time to work through all of those pieces. Extending understandings are like recommended readings. Here is the Christy Belcourt piece, the poem, and my past students' provocation around what it means to be a treaty person disrupting Canadian narratives. If there are any questions, please stay on and I will try to answer them as best as I can. Thanks for your patience at the beginning of class today where I made that mistake. I apologize. Take care. Have a great long weekend. Good work. You're doing well. Looking forward to your self-story 3. Good night.